time, and I respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for joining again for our second meeting. And I just want to remind everyone that we want to encourage as much participation as possible. So these meetings are streamed live. We are now live on YouTube, and they're being recorded so that anyone who wants to kind of watch our conversation or take a look at what we're discussing, that you'll be able to after this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll begin. Except I want to get to the right. Hold on 1 second. All right, here we go. All right, here we go. Thank you so much. Perfect. Okay, so last time we did introductions, and there were a lot of, I feel really good. We have a good representative committee here with a lot of good, important viewpoints being represented. And I want to encourage everyone, that's why you're here, to give us feedback and kind of help us with our planning. So as you know, I sent out some articles earlier in the week because, to be quite honest, I wasn't sure if we were going to have our ISB guidance out in time for our meeting today. And as you know, I sent that out too. And the guidance and the articles and all the resources that I sent, I know it was a lot of information, and we've all been sort of poring over it since it was released. And I want to assure you, it's a lot of information for everybody to take in. So we're going to go through some high-level overviews today, some high-level information to make sure that we all kind of are on the same page with some of the things that we know about the fall. So before we get started, I'll just go through our agenda really quickly. Our timekeeper today, we do have some time limits on our conversation just to make sure that we get through our agenda. Ms. Goff is going to be helping us with note taking. I am going to give an opportunity for anybody who had a chance to read through any of the articles or any of the guidance to give us your thoughts, and just in the form of like wows in terms of what was surprising to you. Was there anything surprising that you read that you thought that's interesting? And then what kind of burning questions do we have right now as a group, or what is top of mind for everyone? Then I'm going to go through kind of high level overview of the ISB guidance. Some areas that I see this impacting our instruction and assessment, the learning environment, and then some impacts that we may see to our logistical and operations side. And then kind of next steps and what I think we need to know at this point to continue with our planning. So I always want to remind us of our norms. Obviously, we want this to be a collaborative conversation. I know we have a lot of different viewpoints represented. I know that this is a highly personal issue. It impacts us all in terms of our families, our students, our children, our jobs. And I just want to make sure that we continue to be respectful and kind and presume positive intent throughout the course of this dialogue. And I want people to feel free and comfortable to tell us what their concerns are, so that we can really remain in the role of advisory and giving feedback to the administrative team as we make our plans. And we know that everyone's here to represent a group or a bigger group of people. So we know that. And if you have heard feedback and you want to bring it to the table, please do. That's why we put together this group. So I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your honesty. And I know that we can be thoughtful and respectful of each other as we go through this process. And I do also want to always remind us that whatever we do in our organization, however we return to learning in the fall, that we want our plan to hold true to what we say that we do and what we want for kids, which is to provide quality instruction, learning opportunities, and environments that promote academic achievement, personal growth, and responsible citizenship, and that we should be modeling that for our students all the time. And obviously we want to see excellence and enthusiasm for every student every day. So before we even get to the guidance, I do want to give an opportunity, and I'll be taking some notes, but also maybe our note taker can take notes. Was there anything or any of the guidance that was surprising to anyone, if you had a chance to read through any of the articles or any of the guidance, or even just listen to discussion. There's been a lot of discussion in the past 24 hours. What is surprising to you about the guidance at this point?
Honestly, I was gonna say I'm not really surprised by very much. I mean, I was expecting a lot of it. I mean, we've been preparing and hearing that this is kind of what's coming, so I wasn't overly surprised, I think, by a lot of things that were in there.
I would agree with what Michelle said, but also what surprised me was not what was written in the guidance, but what has sort of been a public conversation since. And a lot of it seems to be focusing on the idea of face mask and face covering for students and differing opinions about that from a parent perspective. So I anticipate we'll have that to deal with. I bet there'll be some very different feelings about that.
I think one of my biggest wows was which I understand is the teachers, if they have a student that they've been in close contact with coming in with COVID, being out for 14 days, and how is that going to affect the shortage we already have on subs, being able to get subs to come into the school during this time for 2 weeks at a time. And so that was a big like, oh, wow, okay, that's gonna be a tough one for us.
That's a great point, Kate.
I'll spring off of what Nate said. It wasn't so much what I saw in the ISBE that was catching my eye. It's what I've been reading and seeing now in ensuing days, and looking at even different ways that other countries are managing it. And I guess the only thing that really surprised me in the ISBE was the number of times it was mentioned students should stay in one place and teachers should move. I kept seeing that in section after section. It just kept coming back. We recommend this. We recommend this. And yeah, and then the debate about the face masks versus social distancing versus children are not prone to catching this, so therefore, why are we punishing them? So that was a lot of what caught my eye.
Thanks, Heather.
I think both what Nate and Heather said in regards to some of the, in the fine arts and wellness, is the face masks and playing instruments or singing or physical activity and exertion, and how that affects all those different subject areas, as well as having a big space and, you know, using the outdoors and things like that.
Thanks, Anne.
I think I did like the fact that they said, you know, try and keep the windows open, get as much fresh air in as you can. And also that they did mention being outdoors, if you can maintain social distancing, you don't have to have a mask on. So I feel like that gives a little bit of sense of relief, like you can offer a break from that, which I think will be important when it's time to start.
That's a good point, Sarah. Thanks.
I was actually a little surprised, and I don't remember if it was in the actual guidance or if it was in the governor's comments about the guidance, but how strongly worded it was. I think it's something like strongly encouraged schools to teach all students in person. And I was not just surprised that it was that strongly suggested. I thought there'd be a little more, I think there was freedom, but I just was surprised.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, we can move to surprises or questions. So we've kind of gone through what was surprising. Some of what we've talked about, I'm sure, are questions. You know, in other words, sub shortages. You know, how are we going to handle 14-day quarantines or closing classrooms? How are we going to handle teachers moving and not students moving? Inside versus outside, the face mask and protection issues. What other questions are kind of top of mind right now? So, and also the issue of just certain classes and their specific needs, especially in terms of fine arts, physical education, chorus, etc. What other questions?
One of the questions I had was the reduction of class sizes. Since class sizes need to be reduced, how is that going to impact what we do and how we teach? One of the things I read, I can't remember which article it was in, one of the recommendations was a teacher could be teaching and then it could be, the instruction could be broadcast in another room. So I thought that was interesting. You know, maybe if a TA was in the other room and the teacher switched which room he or she was teaching in. So that, I thought that was interesting.
Yep.
One concern that I have about students staying together, I think the recommendation is good, but when we look at different math levels and different foreign language classes and we look at different resource periods, it sounds like tracking to me. And I would want to be cautious in how we implement that so that we serve all of our students well and there aren't students that are in certain tracks unintentionally perhaps for their entire school day.
Good point. Thanks, Joe.
I had seen a reference to the relaxing of licensure requirements for teachers. I didn't have the opportunity to look specifically at what that was. My assumption being that there would be some flexibility given to schools as far as assigning teachers, perhaps even to teach subject areas that they're not certified in. And, you know, that'll be a thing to learn more about if we're considering making some adjustments to our schedule.
I think the licensure things that I've seen have more to do with extensions or renewals of licensures, but that's certainly a topic of conversation in terms of how can we get creative with assignments if we have all these variables, right? In terms of lower class sizes or greater social distancing or remote versus, you know, kids in, kids out. Yeah.
And not to bring it right back to masks, but I will. There was some discrepancy between whether a face shield is acceptable or a mask is acceptable. And I think those are things we'll have to figure out too.
And it was interesting because I sat in on ISB's webinar yesterday where they were very clear. They were not as clear in the guidance, but they were clear in the webinar that face shields are okay. And it was asked multiple times in multiple different ways, almost to like ad nauseum. But face shields are going to be okay for students, staff, anyone who would rather have a face shield. Now, there's conflicting information about how effective a face shield is versus a face mask, but I think that's going to be a personal decision according to the guidance.
And to add on to that, I would also wonder if there will be more guidance specifically on face masks, because from what I've read in other sources, you can only wear them for so long. They need to be switched out. They need to be cleaned a certain way. And so I think all of those pieces will probably need to be considered as well in determining what would be best for our students.
Yeah, it's a good point, Tracy. And I think from what I'm hearing in terms of like, so now there's all the commentary about the guidance and all the questions coming up from various organizations, from teachers unions to attorneys and law firms. But that's definitely a question that keeps coming up in terms of if we're going to be requiring, which we have to require personal protective equipment, then what are we going to do in terms of procedures around that, you know, and do we have some consistency to what we expect of that personal protective equipment, especially for
my other wonder is about the piece on the changing the policy around wearing face masks and policy violations, and how those will be managed and dealt with, because I do have a concern if we're disciplining and managing those policy violations in a certain way. And so I just want to ensure that you know, we take a good look at and maybe get a little bit more guidance about that piece.
Yep. Thank you for that.
I think a lot of the guidance also said you should do this and then finished with as practicable. So there's a lot of flexibility. And for example, I've been talking with lots of other school districts about transportation, and most of them are still planning on putting 40, 45 kids on a school bus versus, because if you had to social distance, you'd put 7 on a school bus, and that is not practicable. And if we do that, we're going to need to have some strong policies on personal protective equipment and, you know, kids need to wear masks. If they don't, what are the consequences, things like that, and how does that cascade down the line? Same with class sizes. We already in Lake Bluff have very low class sizes. If you can fit people 6 feet apart and you can fit 20 in the room and there's a class size of 23 or something like that, I think many districts are not really reducing their class sizes unless they're extreme, like 29 or so, and just doing the best they can to spread kids out and have them wear PPE during class, because that's the practical thing to do.
That's a great point, Jay, because it's been a huge subject. I'm surprised nobody brought up the physical distancing aspect of the guidance, because they really relaxed it in terms of saying to the extent possible or as much as possible, physically distance students. And there were a lot of questions about that, because essentially what they're saying is bring in as many kids as you can and space them out as far as you can. And that was the point of having the face masks all the time inside. Was because there may not be a way for school districts to keep a 6-foot distance. And the 50 student requirement also goes to the bus. So 50 students, no more than 50 students in one space, separated as much as possible. So yeah, I can see where a lot, and locally decided, which is great, but also is tough, right? To kind of make those decisions the right way for your community. Yep, it's a great point.
I had a quick question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say about the face masks. I'm hoping that we're already looking into like how we're going to source them, seeing as that they'll be most likely required to be provided by the schools. And I would just hate for like a day lost of school because we didn't have enough of the proper equipment for everybody. Because I'm sure everybody's going to go scrambling for these masks as soon as they can.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, and I know Jay has already been working on that. The state is allocating some vendors directly to school districts, and I know Jay was right on top of filling out, to the greatest extent, the support that we could get for our students. But you're right, the PPE is going to be in high demand moving forward.
All students and staff will have at least 2 cloth face masks to start the year. We've also got several thousand disposable ones, and we're looking at sourcing more. It's just, I think the thing we still need to do is secure some face shields. That's something we have not done yet, but we'd like to provide them to our bus drivers, to any staff member who wants one. And then, as we talk, students may prefer to use face shields. So we need to look into that. But the quantity of masks that we will need for the year is really still a big question, and I'm not sure how many to go out and get, but we do have enough to start the year.
We have about 2 minutes left in this time for this topic. I just wanted to add in, just from thinking about instruction and assessment, one of the things that just kept, it's mentioned on page 21 of the guidance document that employing curriculum grounded in best practice and pedagogy is more essential now than ever. And so I'm just grappling with, and I'm sorry if this is too in the weeds for some, but how do we balance best practice and the progressive instructional approaches that we've worked so hard to support our teachers with and tackle? Because I feel like it's going to be harder. It's hard to do that in terms of differentiation. They mentioned small group, but that's just one piece of it. I feel like it's a lot easier to fall back on some of the traditional practices. They even show the image of desks in rows. And so that's kind of taking up some space in my brain.
I appreciate you bringing that up and bringing it back, because ultimately to get to our mission and vision, we've been doing a lot of hard work to make sure that we are up on best practice, and all of these recommendations take us back a few steps. So it's going to take some creativity, and I know that we will be able to tackle that, but that really does need to be top of mind regardless of what our opening situation looks like. Thank you. Any other questions before we move on?
Just bring off of Kelly, the one thing I just keep thinking and have been going through my head a lot is we're looking at a real dynamic shift in just how everything's going to be. So for those of us who've been in this career a long time, we're going to be doing something we've never done before. And it's a whole paradigm shift. And that's going to come with a lot of frustration and a need for flexibility. And I'm just concerned about making sure we have the right supports in place to support our students and our teachers when it comes to that emotional wellness side. Because, it's one thing to just say to every kid, put on your mask. It's another thing if it's now the 5th day, you're trying hard to provide instruction, your Zoom isn't working, those kinds of things, that worries me a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing it up, Heather, because a lot of the guidance does talk about now we're not in an emergency situation anymore. We're not in triage mode. So we need to be doing traditional grading practices. We need to be holding kids accountable. We need to be creating solid learning experiences for students and not only addressing traditional curriculum mandates, but also coming back with an eye towards equity and inclusion and addressing all the social issues that have been kind of hitting us from all sides right now, as well as the mental and physical wellness of everyone in our communities. So you're absolutely right. This is going to be a big challenge.
I was just wondering about how to handle situations where families don't feel comfortable sending kids to school, and what we need to do for that. And the concern for me is being able to provide all students, with instruction, but also not making it a double duty for, on teachers and things like that. So I think finding the best way to balance that and how to handle that situation is a good question.
Thanks, Vanessa. Yep.
Mm-hmm. I think that the one, I know we're almost done, Kelly. The one thing I wanted to just say, and it's a question, it's a reminder, if we were coming back to school and this wasn't even present, it would still take at least a week for everybody to get into a routine and talk about, this is how we walk through the hall. And, even in middle school, this is how you navigate the building. And now we're talking about a whole, we as teachers need to learn the new way that we need to do this. And we have to teach the kids and we have to figure it out. And so I just want us to be mindful that that is also we're not going in okay, it's the 3rd day of school, let's get into our math lesson. While yes, we want to do that, we also have a lot to figure out just logistically, on top of what we normally would, figuring out those back to school routines are just different now and are going to take more time, I feel like. And I think we need to remember that.
They will.
That's my concern.
And we talk a lot about going slow to go fast. And taking our time in the beginning to build community and to build trust and to set routines so that later we can really pick up momentum and make sure that, our learning experiences are really effective. So that's a great point, Michelle. We will all be learning new routines. All right, we're going to, and if you have other questions, please send them. But I'm going to move on to kind of looking at some of the high level guidance that I just picked up, and some of the things that we're going to be keeping as non-negotiables in our planning. So we talked a little bit about appropriate PPE, including face masks. There's been a lot of questions about whether or not face masks need to be required at all times indoors. Right now, we are being told yes. So if you're inside, regardless of how much physical distancing is taking place, we will need to ensure that all students and staff are wearing some kind of face mask or face covering. Like I said, a shield is now an option, which it wasn't even spelled out in the guidance, but it's been very clear that that is okay. We need to prohibit more than 50 individuals from gathering in a space. And we're kind of into semantics at this point of defining what a space means. And right now, a space means any space in a school, regardless of the size. So even though we may have some really big spaces like gyms that could accommodate more than 50 students, physically distanced more than 6 feet, at this point right now, that is considered one space. There is a little talk about partitions. And we're starting to get down to that granular level. Like if we normally partition out a bigger space into 2, can we count that as 2 spaces? I think we're probably going to get to that point. We'll probably get to that point. We also need to define outdoor spaces because the guidance is pretty clear about using as much outdoor space as possible, and that we still need to adhere to the guidance of less than 50 individuals in a space. And then when you get outside, the outside spaces need to be at least 30 feet away from each other. So defining outdoor spaces is important for us too, so that if a classroom wants to bring students outside for, say, a recess, that's great, as long as they stay 30 feet away from the other classroom that's outside at the same time. If students are able to maintain a physical distance of around 6 feet outdoors, then they can take their masks off. So we talked about that a little bit. Kids are going to need that kind of break. We also know we live in Illinois, and there's going to come a time when outside is not going to be as hospitable as inside. So we're going to be having to think about that. The social distancing or physical distancing should be observed as much as possible, which was really kind of surprising guidance for us. But I think came from, you know, the State Board of Education's wishes to get as many kids back as possible. And knowing that all of our school buildings are different, all of our class sizes are different, all of our, you know, communities are different. And they did work with the Department of Health on the guidance. So I want to make sure that we all know this, that, you know, ISB worked really close with the Illinois Department of Health on the guidance. And so the fact that the guidance is saying as much as you can possibly do it, we know that that's okay. That's a safe option. And I think that's why the face masks are being required, because there may be times, and we even knew this as educators, right? It's hard to know where all your kids are all the time, let alone measure 6 feet between them at all times too. So it's a good thing we have a little bit of flexibility there. We haven't talked at all about screening and surveillance, but there is definitely a component of the guidance that talks about conducting screenings and surveillance for illness, although that has changed a lot from what we thought that it was going to be. So at this point, we do have to have students certify, students and staff certify, self-certify is okay, that they are symptom-free. And as of about 2 hours ago, I was hearing that that doesn't even need to be a daily situation. So we may be able to have parents or guardians or anyone who's caring for a child sign off that they would never send their child with any of, you know, a certain set of symptoms. And that would be enough to acknowledge that our parents and caregivers would be watching for those symptoms and not sending their children to school should they be exhibiting any of those symptoms, which is nice. And in one sense, because it kind of takes away a burden from the school for diagnosing and looking, because we also know that with this particular virus, even if there are no symptoms present, including a fever, that a student may still have it or a staff member may still have it. So I think that's where that came from. However, we will also be operating in a situation where students may present with symptoms, and we will know what those symptoms are, and we'll have to be doing then our own surveillance, you know, checking temperatures, having kids sent home. At this point, we know that it's 100.4. That's the threshold. If a student presents with a temperature over 100.4, that we will need to be having parents pick them up. And then requiring an increase in school-wide cleaning and disinfection. And that, I think, is not just the facility, you know, and I know Jay and the custodial group have been working really hard on making sure that our buildings are safe that way. But I also think that that is going to be on us to ensure that hand washing is happening as often as possible, to ensure that, you know, desks are being wiped down. If students do have to move, that those desks and things are being wiped down. Although, and stop me if you've heard something different, what I'm hearing is not a lot of transmission is happening from touching of surfaces. The majority of the transmission that I'm hearing from is coming from breathing, and the transmission through the breath. So I feel like that's where the face mask is really, really important. The disinfection is important too, but maybe that's where the face masks have come in a little bit more important. And I just want to emphasize that we don't have a choice on these things. At this point, all public and non-public schools serving any children have to follow these guidelines. The other point that's really strong in the guidance is that at any point, we need to be prepared to return to a remote learning situation. And what was really clear to me in the ISB webinar yesterday, the phrase that they kept talking about was, we need to prepare for any student, classroom, or school to return to remote learning at any point. So if a student needs to be self-quarantining for whatever reason, if a classroom needs to be because of close contact, or if a school gets to the point where the infection rate is big enough, then we all have to be ready for any of those circumstances to return to a remote learning situation. Close contact is being defined as closer than 6 feet for more than 15 minutes. So if we have a person who tests positive or is suspected positive who has been in close contact with anyone, then those individuals would need to self-quarantine for at least 14 days. And I don't believe that we're going to be seeing any relaxing on that guidance. So potential impacts to instruction, we've talked a little bit about it. So when we talk about our learning environment for students coming back in person, number one, we've talked a little bit, the physical environment is going to be different, right? We're going to be back to desks and all facing the same way, in rows, separated, okay, which really is going to have an impact on our pedagogy, because we really know that the best way for kids to learn is to talk and to interact and collaborate, communicate with each other, work together on things. And that is going to be very difficult to do, given that the physical arrangement needs to change so much. We also know that we're being advised that students not travel through the building as much as teachers. And of course, we want to keep everyone safe. So what that means for us is that our teachers will, especially the ones who will be traveling more to more than one classroom, there'll be additional kind of support we're going to need to offer to them in terms of personal protection or time to be able to wash their hands or change protective equipment and those kinds of pieces. Obviously, also for students traveling around the buildings, we're going to have to be determining, one-way hallways, one-way stairways, one-way entrances and exits, which again, to Michelle's point, is going to take a lot of rethink, right? We need to retrain our brains to operate that way. And I don't know about you, but I'm just getting used to the grocery store. And I know I only go there once a week, but I still forget where the entrance is and where the exit is now and how to move through aisles in one way. I'm not used to doing that. So that will take some time.
Lisa, I also just wanted to jump in here to let you know that our architect firm is working on a plan for flow through the building, and as well as how to space out students in their classroom.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, it's really helpful to have all these different organizations that know our facilities really well. That's great. And then obviously when we talk about service delivery, so we have students who have individualized education programs or who have specialized service that they need throughout the day. And that delivery might look different. Instead of the student traveling to the teacher may be coming to provide more of the support or therapy in class. And so we're going to have to be rethinking that potentially. And then obviously, and this speaks to the flexibility and the challenge that Heather was talking about. At any given point, we're going to have to be running 2 programs. So I think, Sarah, you talked about the potential of maybe streaming, lots of things have been talked about in terms of how do we reduce the burden on our teachers, but also because we're going to have to be essentially running 2 learning situations at once all the time. So that's a lot of planning and a lot of preparation and a lot of support that our teachers and students will need during this time. Any other potential impacts that I kind of missed in terms of big areas?
I would say eating lunch is something else we also have to consider. Whether we rotate and put some kids in the cafeteria for part of the time and the rest eat in the classroom, or how we're going to space that out. Our Quest, our food service partner, has come up with some guidance, and I just got that today, so we'll be reviewing that, and they're also want to have a dialogue about how to best meet our needs.
I appreciate that. And that is something that was interesting in the guidance too. Obviously you can't eat with a mask on, so kids will have to have their masks off when they're eating, which means we do have to be pretty vigilant about the physical distancing during lunch.
That would also, I think, apply to like snack time in our classrooms. I know in the elementary, we have them in the morning and in the afternoon. And then also the element of like choice time and play with the materials in the classroom and the space between students, I think is going to be a really big issue also in the primary grade.
Thanks, Erin. That gets to a thing that I didn't talk about, which is shared materials. We love it when kids can share materials and we don't have to have everything clogging up their desks. But at this point, we will not be sharing materials. So in the early childhood situation where a lot of those dramatic play and those kinds of pieces of equipment, even math manipulatives and things that we're used to having one set of things rotating, that's going to be something we're going to have to address.
We are at time for this topic.
Thank you. Does that include both operations and logistics?
It does.
All right, I'm going to go through this really quick. So there's also some operational pieces that we're going to have. We talked a little bit about screening and surveillance. We've talked about personal protective equipment. We're going to need to talk about procedures for closing down, and I believe we'll get some more guidance on that in terms of like, what is the threshold for the school? What is the threshold for a classroom? And then obviously substitute teachers is going to be an issue. And I know that our admin has been working really hard to boost our sub pool and not only take a look at expanding the pool, but also recognizing that some of our subs may feel more comfortable in person. Some may only feel comfortable doing remote support, substitute support. So trying to identify with our subs where they feel comfortable helping. But there's definitely going to be a lot of those kinds of logistical and operational pieces as well. Anything else on this that I missed?
I'm just thinking also about arrival and dismissal, which feels like operations or logistics.
Yep. And to Jay's point, transportation, right? Because we will be limited in the number of kids that we can put on a bus. Okay, so given these requirements, and we know that we don't have a choice on a lot of it, and how it looks will really be up to the administrative team to try to figure out, and with our partners, our architects and our nurses. Just want you to know our nurses have been meeting with me since May. And with Dr. Sophie and our administrators, our nurses are totally on top of all this and have been looking at all the guidance for quite some time. So we'll be partnering to figure out exactly what this could look like in our schools to make it as effective and safe for everyone. But at this point, I feel like there's some things that we need to know to help us with our planning. And there's two big areas that I feel like we need to be getting some information on. One is family and student preference. So given this situation that we're going into, not knowing everyone's medical conditions or the situations that they face in their own homes, we really need to know at this point, since we are now looking at opening up our schools to in-person instruction, what percentage of our families would feel comfortable with the guidelines that we're going to have to adhere to sending their children to school. And along with that, we're going to have to be asking if they are comfortable doing that, to what extent would they be able to provide transportation? Because I want to make sure that we can get all of our kids to school that want to and that can be here. And then the other side of it is our faculty and staff constraints. I know that our faculty and staff want to be here and want to support our programs. Obviously, they also have situational, situational issues that they're coming up in their own families or their own homes. And who can attend in person. It may look really different than usual. So I know I've been working with Michelle a little bit to collect some of that information from our faculty and staff. And I think we're at the point now where we really need to start knowing, exactly now that we know what the guidance is and we know we're moving towards that in-person piece, where is everyone thinking that they're going to be able to go with that guidance on their own terms. So would like to be putting out a survey within the next couple of days to families, asking those two big questions. We know the guidance is encouraging us to get as many kids back as safely as possible. Here are some of the non-negotiables that we're going to have to deal with as a system. And then the comfort level of our families in terms of returning, and then the same for our staff and faculty. Any thoughts on that or other things that you think we should be asking at this point?
I'd also like to just also take a quick temperature check with our parents in the community to make sure that they have the support they need, so that if we do go to e-learning, are they comfortable and able to use, you know, the programs? Like if they're using Seesaw, are they okay doing that? Like, are all of our platforms for learning, is there any sort of like crash courses that parents perhaps need in order to support their kids, and just make sure that we have some inventory on that, and if there's any needs in the community for this.
Great, thanks, Audrey.
Thinking like a parent, and I don't know how easily done this is because it's sort of putting the cart before the horse, but I think that it would be helpful for a parent to sort of visualize if I say I'm uncomfortable sending my child to school, what exactly does the alternative look like? Is it what we experienced at the end of the school year? Is it something different from that? I know in part where we can't answer that question because we need to know how many we'd be necessarily not having in our building to be able to answer it, but it's sort of a sticky subject in that way to ask, I guess.
I agree. There's a lot of unknowns so yeah. And to both of your points, I think that's a huge part of it for parents, is what would that remote learning piece look like? There is more remote learning guidance being worked on by ISB right now that should be released in a couple of weeks. Of course, it's always not super helpful for us because we're trying to plan in advance. But definitely, there's the guidance is pretty clear that we will need to use the feedback from what happened in the spring to make sure that our remote learning situation is improved and enhanced for parents based on their feedback. So I think that we could at least, you know, to your point, Nate, maybe assure and collect some more information like Audrey's suggesting, on how better we could make that situation. Yeah.
I'm not sure where this goes, but I also, as I thought about that guidance and read it, it almost seems like a class or students could go to remote learning for 10 to 14 days multiple times and at any point without any warning. So I don't know if that just needs to be put out there.
Yeah, I think
parents and families think about it, because that could be a challenge.
No, that's a great point, Christy. And you're absolutely right. I hate to say this, but in my mind, it's inevitable that there's going to be big sections of our schools and district that'll be remote for portions of the school year. So I guess my thought process is going to, given the choice, you know, of being in person or maybe enrolling by trimester into a remote situation, you know, what parents at this point would enroll remote trimester 1, trimesters 1 and 2, or all year, you know, just so that we can plan a little bit, because ultimately our staffing is going to depend on how many students we have in and how many we have out. Yeah, but I think it's great to reiterate that even if you say you're in person, we might not be able to do that all year. Yeah.
We have to go into this knowing this is fluid.
Yeah.
It's a fluid situation and it's going to change, and we have to be flexible because that's so easy to be.
Yeah.
And it's fluid.
Teachers are usually planners. I don't know if we have that mode, but it's hard to be flexible, but we're going to have to be. Yeah.
And I think another thing to think about is for faculty and staff to consider their families when their kids are told that their daycares or their schools are closed, then that causes them to have to leave, or if their kids come in contact with somebody and then they're around that person, then it causes that chain of or that domino effect of, now I've been exposed, but I didn't find out for 3 days. Now we have to go back 3 days and see who has been in contact with that person. So just kind of to remind families that it's not just who people come into contact with immediately at the school, that it could, you know, extend further.
Yeah, the contact tracing is going to be part of what we're going to have to be doing as well. Thanks, Kelly. Mm-hmm.
I'm just concerned about when asking parents' preferences, it might be good to get a quick gauge on how many of our parents would need support if you all of a sudden went to, your children are home for the next 2 weeks because someone in their group tested positive. If you've got working families, they can't always scramble that quick. And then a lot of it's that uncertainty that caused so much frustration. How can we make sure we have things in place? What would help parents in those situations being frustrated and needing help? What can we do to offer help or at least point them in a direction?
That's a great point. Thanks.
I was just thinking the same thing, Heather, of maybe possibly including on the survey somewhere that if we were forced to go to remote learning, you know, check this box if you would have childcare issues, something like that. I mean, I know it's difficult. It's not our job to figure all of that out, but I think that that's really important to know for us, you know, and just going back to Heather's point of that, I think it possibly could be considered to put on the survey.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful. We have changing leadership here. We also have changing leadership at our park district. But I'm hopeful that in the next couple of weeks, I'll be able to connect with whoever's new coming in there and seeing what options that we might have in the community in terms of pointing people to support for those issues. But I think that's a good point. If we could get a handle on what percentage of our population would need that support, that would be helpful.
I'm teaching summer school, and I know a lot of my parents are working parents, but the problem they had with e-learning was they could help their kids after school hours. So the accountability piece that, like, yeah, maybe they could get on Google Meet, but like if they can't get their work done until 3 to 7 or 5 to 7, does that count against them when they're just no one's there to help them navigate through it?
That's a good point, Anna. And we do have to take a look at, because now that we're in it, remote learning 2.0 isn't the same in terms of do no harm. So you're right. With a return to traditional grading practices, we're going to have to outline a little bit. I was in that same situation. My kids were doing night school. I could not help them during the day. So we're going to have to tweak maybe some of our reporting and feedback loops for parents so that we can address that when we're in remote learning. Thank you. Any other thoughts on collecting information? I don't want to do too many questions on the survey because we don't have a ton of information to give at this point in terms of specifics, because we need it in order to plan, but is there anything else?
The only other thing that comes to mind, and it applies to me personally, my wife's in healthcare, and I wonder for our students that their parents are in healthcare, or for those on staff that are, you know, spouses, partners are in healthcare, and there could be that high elevated risk for like an exposure somewhere else, to be able to, what's the process of reporting that, saying like, hey, my spouse came in contact with something, I've been exposed to that through that, like where do we draw the line? And that might just come out in further guidance, but I know that we have many students that their parents are in hospitals or in doctors' offices, and that could complicate matters at a higher level than some other profession.
Yeah, I think we're going to get more guidance on that, but that's a great thing to be thinking about through this whole process, because it's going to be interesting, the tracing part. And to your point, where do you draw the line? Nicole, did you have something too?
No, I was just going to reiterate kind of what you said. I think with the initial survey, I've heard from friends and neighboring communities how their initial survey asking about their comfort level and transportation was very simple and to the point. And I think that initial one should be very simple and easy to complete for the greatest compliance possible. And then perhaps subsequent surveys get down to greater detail. But I think almost that first one is that initial pulse. And then we work from that data to kind of striate additional surveys.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I think that's true. Because ultimately we're going to need some information too about how our students are feeling about coming back to school and what social emotional supports, you know, we need to provide, and how remote learning went in terms of academics and perceptions that way, so that we can support. But I think you're right, for this first one and for our planning, it needs to be pretty quick turnaround and get as many people to fill it out as possible. All right, any other questions or thoughts about next steps? So we're going to, my goal, for this committee, we're not going to meet next week. It's July 4th weekend. I know people are going to want to take some time, and the admin team and I need some time to get planning and make sure that we're clear on the guidance and what we need to do. And the next time that we get together, I may send you survey results in between, just so that you have an idea of where the survey comes out. My goal is to have it returned by July 2nd. So this is going to be a quick turnaround. In the next couple of days, the survey will go out. I may send you those results just so you have kind of an idea of where we're at. And then the hope is that when we meet again on July 9th, you will have some things to review, to give feedback on in terms of early communication to the community, because my goal again is to get something out with some substance by July 16th, so that people have a better idea of what things are going to look like. Is there anything else that?
Well, I just have a question.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I thought you had said this. Are we going to split like into elementary and middle school? Because I just like all these questions keep coming into my head about our schedule and lockers and the locker room and all, and they're just very specific to middle school and like what Joe was saying about tracking. So I'm just wondering, like, I feel like the summer is going fast, but I know it's only June, but just throwing that out there.
You're right. It is going fast, and I appreciate it. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to split up, because initially my thought was kind of the instruction side and then the logistics side of it. But it might be better to go both and then split up elementary and middle school now that you're saying it, because there's so many building specific issues with regard to that. I know that in our planning, we'll be reaching out and working a lot with Michelle and then the teachers on this group to kind of run ideas past you as we're in our draft planning, because you guys are closest to the situation. So thanks for throwing that out there, because I think our next meeting, we will break into a smaller group so that there can be more conversation around what we're putting out.
And I think it would be really helpful, and maybe this is just me being more of an OCD person, for those who know me, it might be helpful to have even a very simple statement for our staff as to what can we be doing right now that might help ease our worries in the fall. If it's even something like, face it, we will have to do a remote component of some kind, great, let us know that. And then if you have the time and the materials and you want to start building things now, at least it feels less stressful when you've got a month and a half to build things, not 2 days before they need to be posted. So even just something very simple for the staff is like, here's what you can do if you're worried about the fall. We don't know what it's going to look like, but here's something you could do.
That's a good idea, Heather. Thank you. I will be sending something out soon to staff. So I'll be sure to include that. Anything else for the group?
I have one question. When I was reading that guidance that came out just recently, the 60-page guidance, when it talked about the remote learning, it was talking about 5 clock hours of active learning repeatedly. And, I think that is a bit more than what we experienced, most recently. And I think that's going to be a change. And we need that tool regardless, I think, because if it's a fallback or if it's a hybrid. And so, and I apologize, I did not attend last week, so maybe that was discussed, but how is that going to be achieved? And is that something that kind of, to Heather's point, like, could that be our initial focus? Because that could be the content regardless of in-person or online.
It's a good question. I don't think we talked too much about it last week because we didn't have the guidance yet. And I still wasn't sure where that things were going to fall with the 5 clock hours. There's definitely a lot of talk about what that means. And there's still some flexibility in that in terms of looking at all aspects of the school day. So synchronous instruction or face-to-face instruction, plus independent activities, plus face-to-face support, or looking at pre-recorded videos and those kinds of things. So they're still kind of defining those 5 clock hours as not all face-to-face. But I do remember from our survey, what we did talk about last week was our survey data that came back. And we definitely heard that the request was for more face-to-face instruction or synchronous instruction. And so I think, to Sarah's point, I think she may have brought it up earlier, what could we do to maximize, since we're in person, how can we maybe leverage that to provide more face-to-face, you know, kind of synchronous with a classroom maybe, so that we're not double preparing, but also keeping kids in the, you know, there's definitely some concerns around that, you know, administrators are talking about, and how can we logistically make that work and keep everyone safe, and, you know, privacy concerns and all those types of things. But I think that's the goal. We want to, if a student is remote and having to be in that situation, that it doesn't feel completely removed from what's happening in person, and that we're keeping as synchronous as possible, if that makes sense. Keeping everyone on the same page as much as possible, recognizing that it's a lot on teachers to run those two programs at the same time. So that's exactly, you're right on. Yep.
And to that point, in brainstorming, like, okay, what does good look like? And I'm sure you've been given a lot of resources that I'm not privy to, or I don't know, but I know like some of the
Nicole, I think you froze. Okay, I think we might have lost her. Nicole, if you can hear me, can you send your comments to me when you get a chance? But we'll definitely be talking about what remote looks like for sure. And I'm not gonna hold anyone if there's any more comments. Okay. All right, I thank everyone for your attendance today. And if there's anything, always, if there's anything that you think of after today's meeting that you want, you're like, oh, I completely forgot to say that thing that I was thinking about, just email us or email your administrator or somebody you feel comfortable with, and you know, we'll get the information and we will keep planning. So thanks so much, everyone. And I hope you have a good couple of weeks. Enjoy the holiday. Get some rest and relaxation. I think once July hits, we're all going to be in major planning and preparation mode. So looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Lisa.
you.
Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.